Welcome back to Fast Gadgets. As you know, I'm Mark, and this is Pixie. She's going to be my helper for today. So, the conversation I want to have today is about macOS. Now, I really was having a hard time deciding on the title of this particular video. Did I want to call it macOS is Dead or macOS is Deprecated? And in essence, I wanted to use the word deprecated, not depreciated, but deprecated. Deprecated meaning that the operating system really is pretty old and it probably should be discontinued in lieu of a newer and better operating system. The big question is, does Apple have a newer operating system to replace it? We're going to talk about it right now. So, we've got Mac OS. It is the evolutionary change over OS X. But is it enough to be making evolutionary changes in light of what's happening in the industry today? And I don't think so. Bold strides, visionary changes are what's needed, and lately Apple hasn't been doing that. And with Mac OS, with the tiny incremental changes that we've been seeing, is it really enough? And personally, I do not think so. But is it possible that they're in the process of creating a new operating system at Apple to replace Mac OS? And to that end, I would say if Tim Cook is not being reactionary and he's being visionary, that yes, indeed, it is possible that there is another operating system coming. And if so, are there any telltale signs? Well, one sure sign is when the operating system is not receiving any major changes. Some would say, well, the touch bar was a major change, but I actually don't consider it a major change. Now, it was including hardware and software, but it's more of an incremental change. It really didn't reflect on the changes in the operating system. So there is some change that we're going to be seeing coming in the future, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is an indicator of revolutionary change. And that's just my opinion. I think it was incremental. So one of the things I had expected to see was a touchscreen. Say hi, Pix. Say hi. But we didn't see a touchscreen. Now, Apple doesn't think at this point in time that touchscreens have much utility and are necessary. But if you look at the iOS design, obviously they do understand the value and usage of a touchscreen, even on the iPad Pro. So it is possible that we could see in the future some type of fusion of the operating system between iOS and macOS into one awesome operating system. That's entirely possible. But I'm thinking that's probably unlikely in the near future, and here's why. Now, and this is another indicator, if they really were working on a new operating system, I would think that they would want to keep it very quiet right now. Why? Because if they were going to release a new operating system for their MacBook Pros and MacBooks, and they were to release that information now, it might deter shoppers from buying the 2016 MacBook model, as well as possibly next year's 2017 model. If they're really working on this new revolutionary operating system, it would be smarter to wait until 2017 and then start dropping hints, I would think, instead of putting out the information right now, because they really don't want to slow what they have now. The problem with this possibility is I can't tell for sure if Tim Cook has the visionary cap on right now, or what personally I think he's been doing, the reactionary cap. So he's been reacting to the industry, which to some extent you do have to do in order to maintain production and put out products that your consumer wants, but you also have to push the envelope when you're visionary and go into the risk area and produce a product that is compelling but relatively untested in the industry. So you have to take somewhat of a risk as a company and say, we're going to do this, we're going to push this, even if it is a risk to our company, to try to propel the industry forward again. We need our new cash cow, in other words. So those are considerations. So when Apple was preparing to release OS 10, they were talking about it and they were showing the beta of OS 10 while still producing Mac OS 9 and selling systems with Mac OS 9. But most of the systems that they were selling at that time, when they got really close to the edge of having gold code for OS 10, would have been able to run OS 10 at that time. So they were very careful in that regard. And it's still a little bit too far out to make an announcement about a new operating system if that is the plan. Now, if they're in reactionary mode, here's the problem. If you look at the history of Palm, the company, and Palm OS, they made this truly revolutionary handheld product that everybody loved, and it was absolutely fantastic. The problem was, for a good decade, they made only evolutionary changes. Now, at the time, I had the original Palm. I had a Palm 3. I had a Palm M105. I had a Palm Pre, which had the modern WebOS, but here's the problem with what happened with Palm. They did this great product initially, and then they released evolutionary changes, and the industry caught up with and surpassed Palm. They made systems like iPhone and Android phones, and although Palm was releasing phones, it had its relatively antiquated Palm OS on it. It wasn't until well after iPhones and the Android phones were well established that Palm realized they had to do something. They created WebOS and they started releasing phones with what was truly an awesome revolutionary OS, but they coupled it with weak hardware, and it really, really hurt sales. So the big thing I'm saying here is if Apple is producing a new operating system, they probably want to move a little bit faster, because I'm going to just say, for my opinion, I think that Mac OS is deprecated. In other words, it is code that probably should be moved to a newer operating system, a newer graphical user interface. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to throw away all the underlying BSD code. You could still use all that work that you've created, but I really do think they have to make a revolutionary change to the next operating system that users would be able to embrace. And it does remain to be seen if that's going to happen. Looking at what other companies are doing in the industry, my computer over here is telling me I have new updates for Linux, for Fedora 25. What a surprise. So it remains to be seen whether or not Apple is going to do that, or if they're going to try to rest on their laurels and just kind of continue to sail on with Mac OS. There's been talk about that fusion again between iOS and Mac OS, and that might be the way to go. But certainly that would take some work. And I guess Apple's going to have to consider whether or not the touchscreen idea is a fad or if it's something truly useful. Well, it remains to be seen. As always, thank you for joining Pixie and I for this talk about Mac OS, Palm OS, and OS 10 and OS 9 and the future of Apple and their operating system. Appreciate your being here. I appreciate your support, and I want to say thank you very much, and I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets.